when the United States was attacked and by the Japanese on December the 7th, 1941, and subsequently declared war on Nazi Germany and fascist Italy also. There was a Nazi organization, as it turned out. They used to go after us with baseball bats, and it was a rather harsh environment. I grew up in a loving but very poor household. I mean, by poor, not in terms of happiness. We were a devoted mother and father, and I was the last of 5 children. But I was born in the old East Bronx to a Yiddish-speaking family on July 11th, 1930, in the height of the Great American Depression. And my father, though a skilled garment worker, was out of work. It was something of a struggle, and in a relatively small apartment, one did feel cooped up at times, and the streets of the East Bronx were frequently not very safe because, frankly, there was a Nazi organization, as it turned out, affiliated to Joe McWilliams and the Silver Shirts, who were all thrown into jail when the United States was attacked and by the Japanese on December the 7th, 1941, and subsequently declared war on Nazi Germany and fascist Italy also. But they used to go after us with baseball bats, and it was a rather harsh environment. But I started reading initially Yiddish poetry when I was I taught myself actually to read Yiddish, which I spoke anyway, of course. It was the mother tongue, the Mama Russian for me, when I was about 3.5 or 4. And the earliest poetry I remember, and I still have it by heart, because then as now, I have a preternatural memory for poetry, and indeed sometimes for heightened prose, and an astonishing reading rate, which has never really changed. I started to read the Yiddish poets, in particular Yaakov Gladstein, and my particular favorite, Moshe Leib Halpern. But then I taught myself, which is why my pronunciation has always been so idiosyncratic, I taught myself to read English when I was about 5.5, 6 years old, before I went off to kindergarten, where in fact they began to speak English around me, and I heard it for the first time. I started reading poetry almost immediately, and among the earliest poets whom I remember were really rather simple ones, though beautiful, like A.E. Housman, some of the border ballads, and some Shakespearean songs. But I gradually began to read Shakespeare. I still remember my first reading of Julius Caesar and of Macbeth, which terrified me. I must by then have been 8 or 9 or so. And then I went on to read Milton and discovered modern poetry. And then a very great moment for me, in some ways more determinating even than Shakespeare, was when at the age of 10 in the Melrose branch of the Bronx Library, where I'd been taken by my 3 older sisters, I opened the collected poems of Hart Crane and was utterly fascinated by the rhetoric and the vision and the whole glory of it, and fell in love with Crane's poetry. And for I took the book out incessantly from the Melrose branch, and at my request, for my 12th birthday, my oldest sister, Esther, who last died recently, the last of my living siblings, she was, I would think, about 94 or 95, gave me for my 12th birthday the collected poems of Hart Crane, the earliest book I ever owned, and still with me up in my study on the 3rd floor of this huge old house where my wife and I have lived for half a century now, out of our 53 years of marriage. I was an autodidact. I think I was pretty much self-taught all the way, indeed, through high school, until at the age of 17, having won a special fellowship, I arrived at Cornell University in Ithaca, New York in September 1947, and immediately fell under the sway of a very great teacher. He was then 35, Maya Howard Abrams, M.H. Abrams, a very great scholar of Romanticism and of critical theory. Mike, as we all called him, Mike and I have been close friends now for, my heavens, I was 17 then, and Mike was 35. I am now, at an 18-year difference. I am now 81, and Mike is going on 99 and is alive and healthy and lives in Ithaca, New York. And indeed last year, at my request, came here to Yale and actually gave a poetry reading and then made brilliant comments on the poems, but he says he can't do that again. But if I, my dear, I'm still alive 18 years from now, I certainly will not be going off to another university to read poems aloud and comment upon them due to a series of somewhat debilitating mishaps and malaises. I walk with a cane. When I woke up on the morning of my 37th birthday in the same house here in New Haven, I'd had an awful nightmare in which some great winged cherub, a rather negative angel, and only gradually disentangled it and got rid of the Freudian overtones of it and began to see that it was an image of what the prophet Ezekiel, and then William Blake after him, had called the covering cherub, or as the Hebrew text of Ezekiel says, the Haruf Mimshak, the far-extending cherub, the terrible angel with long, far-extending wings, Mimshak. And he was trying to stifle me. And I came down to breakfast with my wife, the same table that I'm sitting at now. And I said to her, Jean, I've had the most terrible nightmare. And she looked up from the Times that she was reading, the New York Times, and said, Harold, don't bring your nightmares to the breakfast table. So I brooded on that for a while and picked up, I've never learned to type even, and in the age of the computer, I'm more than ever a dinosaur. So I picked up what I use then as now a Pentel black rolling writer, ballpoint pen, and one of my endless big green ledger notebooks, and started to compose a kind of mad rhapsody called the Covering Cherub, or Poetic Influence. A dithyramb, not even knowing what I was writing, a sort of wild kind of affair. And over many years, I gradually revised it to make some sense anyway, but some people would dispute that. And in January 1973, it and 5 other chapters and some interchapters and prose poems, and I don't know what else, were published as this rather wild, quite short little book by the Oxford University Press in New York called The Anxiety of Influence, A Theory of Poetry. The phrase, of course, before Virginia Woolf, marvelous writer as she was, a marvelous literary critic, of course, popularized it, was invented by my great critical hero, Dr. Samuel Johnson, who said that it is by the judgments of the common reader that we must finally decide what is and what is not authentic high literature, which will survive and go on from one age to another and do some good. Johnson has always been my critical hero in the sense that Shakespeare and Wallace Stevens and Yeats and Hart Crane and Milton and so many more, Chaucer, have been my poetic heroes. Johnson taught me, and I read Johnson again every week and have much of Johnson by heart. Johnson in the Lives of the Poets and his great edition of Shakespeare, with its wonderful general introduction. Johnson says that the function of criticism is to transmute or convert opinion into knowledge. In my modest way, I try to be Johnsonian. All of us, we love our husbands and wives, or depending on our sexual orientation, our partners of one kind or another. We love our parents and our relatives and our close friends and our own children and grandchildren. And it didn't take Freud to teach us that. Shakespeare, who precedes Freud in every respect, teaches us that there's always an ambivalent underflow. You make so heavy, as Freud says, a Besetzung, an investment in others, that some element in your own ego, your own deep self, rebels against it, and you have to watch that. And I think that is the phenomenon that is involved in the influence process. People cannot become poets, or indeed strong writers, novelists, critics, essayists, dramatists, story writers, unless they first fall in love with great precursor figures who can be contemporary with them, in fact. But as they develop, they have to find their own space by trying to see what the distance and difference might be which makes their own work necessary and justified. I've had a preternatural memory for really great poetry. In particular, it just memorizes itself in me. Increasingly, though I think at first, not quite consciously, but quite capaciously, I was gathering together on some level of apprehension the relationship of why one poem rather than another jostled the next poem in my head. And it became clearer and clearer to me as I wrote my early books, starting with a book published in January 1959 on Shelley, though that was mostly written back in 1954, originally as a Yale PhD dissertation, and going on through books on Blake and a commentary on Blake and the David Erdman definitive edition of Blake, which is still very much in print, and a book that's never gone out of print, the book for which I was best known for a long, long time, The Visionary Company, a reading of English romantic poetry. I gradually came to realize, as I looked back on what I was doing, without making the hideous mistake of taking myself too seriously, which would always be a disaster. I've always said that I'm essentially a comic critic, and all I get are serious reviews and serious attacks. But I try to see at all times the comedy of poetic influence and the comedy of being an exegete on texts that are, though secular to me, sacred texts. There I seem to be emulating Yeats, and that reminds me that I went on, after several volumes of essays, to write a very large study just called Yeats, about his relationship to Blake and Shelley and romantic tradition in general. I think that came out in 1970 or so, and then I was hovering on the edge of the insight that led to the anxiety of influence, which was that poems, strong poems, are really creative misreadings of precursor texts. They can be imaginary precursors, they're usually composite, and the anxiety, I used to quarrel with a later mentor, Norrie Fry, the great Northrop Frye of Toronto, author of The Fearful Symmetry, a wonderful study of William Blake, and of the, in this age, famous book called Anatomy of Criticism. I don't actually allude to that in my title. I'm thinking of the source for both Norrie and myself. Norrie, alas, is gone now. Burton's great Anatomy of Influence in the 17th century, a very wild and magnificent book. In the original manuscript of what is now published as the Anatomy of Influence, A Theory of Poetry, was about 3 times as large as it is now, but we are in an age where you can't really write enormous critical books anymore. I mean, I've done it in the past with books like Shakespeare, The Invention of the Human, and a huge book called Genius, and some other works of that sort, but from now on, I think books have to be shorter, and I'm sure I'll never again write another book as long. I have a book coming out in September, also with the Yale Press, since it's the 400th anniversary of the King James Bible, called The Shadow of a Great Rock, a literary appreciation of the King James Bible, but it's only 50,000 words, not counting quotations. I love Australian poetry from Judith Wright and Alec Hope on through our great contemporaries, Les Murray and John Kinsler, among others. There are many more. Indeed, I'm haunted by the wonderful Australian communist poet John Manifold, poet of World War II, I suppose. He must be dead many years now, but I remember loving his poetry when I was a little boy. I could never get out of my head a wonderful little poem that he wrote called Fife Tune, when he and his Australian brigade were going off to fight in Western Europe. And one morning in spring we marched from devices, all shapes and all sizes, like beads on a string, but yet with a swing we trod the blue metal, and full of high fettle we started to sing. She ran down the stairs, a 12-year-old darling, and laughing and calling and tossing her bright hair, then silent to stare at the men flowing past her. They were all she could master. adoring her there. It's seldom I've seen a gentler or prettier. I doubt we'll forget her in 2 years or 3, and lucky he'll be whom she takes for a lover when we are far over the treacherous sea. More contemporary Australians knew John Manifold, but he was a communist, rather fierce communist, but a fighting communist and an anti-fascist, and not a great poet. And you can hear the influence of A. Houseman on him even in that poem.
Like, subscribe, notification bell, join the herd.